Hello, I'm Layne Hartsell with the Korea IT Times, and I'm here with Emanuel Pastreich, the director of the Asia Institute, where I'm also a research professor. Emmanuel attended Harvard and Yale, also the University of Tokyo in East Asian Studies. He speaks the languages, and he is highly competent in speaking on the region. And also in world affairs, he's been working on quite a bit in the last few years. Particularly, one topic I want to talk about that he published in the Hangul did I say it right in Korean?
That's correct.
Um, the article that he published in that is what we'll be talking about today. Hi, Emmanuel. How are you today?
Always a pleasure.
So I say Hangul, so my Korean is not so good. So the article you published, it's been about a little under almost 10 years, maybe 8 years, called The Constitution of Information. And the argument you've made a number of times in your work or in your speeches and meetings with young people, all of this stuff throughout the years. And in a time when war, particularly war where we're looking at potential nuclear conflict, mass industrial machinery, all this kind of thing in war, and the social media and media, almost 24/7, review that we can see. And then, of course, the bots, the algorithms, so on and so forth. I want to ask you to go into more depth about this today. So let me start off with the first question. What do you mean by constitution of information?
Right. Well, we start with the assumption, as you had suggested, Layne, that information is being degraded all around us, being altered and manipulated, and also that our capacity to understand, that's to say, our ability to think, is being undermined by sort of patterns of enticement or stimulation, which induce a simplistic sort of two-dimensional thinking and an inability to think long-term or to think in a three-dimensional manner. So information is the front line in the battle that we're fighting today, and having both the ability to process information in a rational, thoughtful, long-term, three-dimensional way, and also to have access to information which is not radically altered or manipulative in nature. You could say that's the core issue today, and that all the other conflicts that we deal with, even issues like concentration of wealth, can be brought back to this question of the alteration and the degradation of information. So it's sort of a goal. It's an ideal for what we would strive is some sort of international constitution of information, which would assure through a sort of complex mechanism, something like the idea of the executive, judicial, and judiciary, executive, judicial, and legislative, have these sort of three competing branches in governance that would assure that information remains reliable, and that it's not abused, and also that we deal with the issue of privacy, which is an extremely complex issue.
Okay, so the Constitution would be the overarching ideas, for example, the U.S. Constitution, where we're from. Now, a constitution information, though, would be transnational, something like the UN, or, we were also talking about the Federation, right? This World Federation type idea that Einstein and them were talking about. So, okay, let's talk about the principles first that perhaps people could agree upon. And then maybe we can touch a little bit on maybe some practical things that can be done. For example, billionaires right now are buying Twitter. Is that a practical example of how to deal with it? So first, with principles.
Right.
Principles, freedom of information, net neutrality. What do you think?
Right. Well, unfortunately, we have this situation in which, when faced with the radical alteration or denial of access to information or fake news, that we're given this. I mean, this is a classic gambit for the last 1,000 years, where the royalty will step in and offer you, we will, Elon Musk will offer you freedom of speech on Twitter, but he's granting it to you as a benefit based on his benevolence, and which he can withdraw at any time at his will, right? It's sort of like Louis the 16th. So the point of a constitution of information, if we think of it in terms of what happened with absolutism in the 17th century, and then the response in the 18th century moving towards the US Constitution, is to set up an alternative to absolutism of billionaires, to say, no, it's not going to be, the owner of Twitter or Facebook who are going to decide whether we have any right to accurate information. And it's not going to be a government which is run by billionaires through their various puppets and clowns, but it has to be we, the people, through a constitutional republic, who participate and set forth rules for how information will be governed. So it won't be governed. Someone has to govern it. I guess that's the underlying theme, right? You can't just have a Wild West. That there has to be some way of asserting that this information is more accurate than that information. However, that mechanism is going to have to be a nuanced and complex one. It can't simply be either Elon Musk or a libertarian free-for-all. It certainly can't be the US government or the Chinese government or the Russian government telling you what the truth is. It's going to require us to be creative, innovative, create new institutions. And I think in that process, as you suggested, it will have to be linked to a new concept of global governance that moves us away from the originally flawed but functional United Nations, which has now essentially been co-opted to a degree that it no longer plays its original function, serves its original function.
So we have net neutrality, we have open information,
Right.
we have verification
Right.
that could go into a constitution. Of course, the UN does have the UN 1948 and the various codifications into law. All of that could be brought in too. Maybe this isn't the UN, maybe it's something else, maybe it is. All right, so what do you think, UN?
Oh, I was just going to say, the United Nations is not a bad name. I have no, problem. I mean, we have this whole thing from the Hague Conference in the late 19th century, which was when we basically put together, to some degree, based on some of Kant and Hegel's ideas, this idea of global governance, and then the League of Nations after the First World War, which was also it was very successful in some respects, but it was flawed by the way in which France and England dominated the decision-making process. And then we had the United Nations, also flawed because of the role the United States and Great Britain and France, same guys, right? I mean, played and distorting it. But we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We want to save much of what was positive in the United Nations Charter. But clearly, United Nations Charter does not address degradation of the environment. It doesn't address the reliability or accuracy of information, because they simply didn't know what was going to happen.
We didn't have this explosion of digital information, and then also the smartphone, which has facilitated this. In the case of the United, okay, so something like this could go through the United Nations, but and I've said this many times in public too. The United Nations is a group of states, right? For example, the Navajo, the Shawnee, the Iroquois, the Karen people, the Hmong people, they don't have a seat at the United Nations. But of course, they're all contributing to the information sphere today too, right? Probably like, I think right now we're at about 63% of the world has access to the internet, and then smartphones are, somewhat around there. If this continues to grow, and then if we continue to have this disruptive mechanism of the bots and algorithms and all that, then the
Right.
constitution of information is only going to be as good as the parchment as it's written, or the digital smart contract today. But now, how do you deal with the attacks on truth, right? So I don't think, yeah, so the data's out there, right? But the information, how that data is put together, who accepts it, what political view, and so forth. This is what's being, basically taking down
Right.
democratic process, right?
Very true. Well, you made a lot of very important points there. I wanted to say just briefly on the question of the native peoples, especially in North America, the United States Constitution was influenced by constitutions of
That's
the
right.
native people, and there's much to be said that in fact that was the strongest part of the constitutional process. And as we go into this new frontier, that it's not just Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, but we should be going back to the original tribes and their concepts of governance and of the individual and the community, which is very inspiring. And then the second part about how we respond, I think technology continues to develop. It has to be an ongoing process. There's no cookie cutter permanent solution to the problem. It has to be constantly wrestled with. So it requires us to deal. I mean, in a way, the two beasts is sort of Orwell on the one hand, and 1994, and Huxley with Brave New World. In the case
Mhm.
of Orwell, his view is this totalitarian enforcing mechanism in which so dictatorship forces you to embrace lies and things that you know are not true, and intentionally denies you access to knowledge, to information which is accurate. The Brave New World model that Huxley puts forth is that your ability to think is so degraded, and you're hooked on stimulation, pleasure, short-term thinking, so you no longer care. I mean, people can put the truth right in front of you, and you're not interested because you want your next fix, your next high, your next buzz. And so both of these models for the threat and information have come true in different respects in the modern day, but they're not the same. The threat is a different one between some particular group trying to alter information and brutally suppress those trying to seek the truth, and the other point, which is to degrade and to seduce, so that people, as Huxley says, don't even know that they've become slaves. We have to deal with both, I think, within the Constitution of Information. And I guess I would conclude this my statement here by saying this is why we need a convention, right? What we certainly do not want is Layne and Emanuel coming down from the mountain with the 10 commandments. I want to say 15
Ivory
commandments,
tower.
like Mel Brooks. But coming down with the 10 commandments and saying, yay, we have spoken. That what we need is some sort of a system maybe starting from today in this discussion, to say, we're going to put together this Constitution of Information, draw together people, thoughtful people, like those who would draft, sort of elders who would draft the Constitution of Information, and have the authority, the knowledge, the wisdom to do so, and clearly not to have any techno tyrants or billionaires or people who have a vested interest at the table.
If there is some pushback, right? So there's like the internet, or what is it called? The the dark web, intellectual dark web.
Right. Well, there
This
are
is
different.
one
Right.
form, one form of pushback. There's other forms like the journalist associations. For example, one of the reporters from Ukraine had indicated that these are white people fighting each other, and they were horrified with it. It's not just Iraqis.
Right.
You know, that's really a strange. He apologized later, but I don't think we should allow that to go by. The journalist associations actually came out, and there was a big uproar about this on the internet. So social media can be effective. Like say,
Absolutely.
you know, for the what is it, that intellectual dark web, you know, Brett Weinstein, for example, the evolutionary biologist, has done work on that. In the other case, for the journalists, there can be pushback. What about for like a regular person like me? You know, I'm consuming information on Facebook or Instagram or something. I see some information about the war, vaccines, COVID,
Right.
you
Right.
name it,
All
whatever.
sorts. All range.
Okay, now, what well, what can I do as a regular person meeting this information sphere without a constitution of information right now? What could I do to work on one? There's a two parts. One is how could I work on a constitution information, and then how do I know to post something that I'm passing on if it's going to be true or not? You know,
Right.
so there's two parts to this question.
Right.
One's
Well, it's an impossible, in a way, an impossible question. I mean, we need to set up new systems of for communication and for verification of information, um, uh, and it's really hard as an individual. In fact, you could say that's the strategy of the opposing forces, is to make sure that we're all sort of individuals, all by ourselves, not able to form institutions. So it's you, Layne, Emanuel, our friends, each individual's in front of our computer hacking away, but we're up against, you know, Twitter or Facebook, or for that matter, NSA or other, you know, Google, other enormous institutions with multi-billion-dollar budgets that are able to push forward with information which is inaccurate or biased. So I guess the answer, based on the Constitution and of course some of the native constitutions, the Iroquois from before,
right.
is one that it has to be participatory, right? And this is the dance. I mean, so the whole point of a constitution is, if there was a simple way to have democratic, transparent, accountable government, you wouldn't need a constitution, right? You need a constitution because there are contradictory elements within the human brain, you know, conflict between the the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, you know, different parts of the brain have different, you know, approaches within society. We tend, you know, if you take all the bad guys and put them in jail, you know, you get another 10% bad guys within, you know, 5 months, because it's structural. Within, well, I believe that in part. I wouldn't sign my name to it, but I think there is something to that argument, that there are structural issues. Anyway, so participatory means that something like Facebook, if Facebook or Twitter are so large that a very large number of the population are getting their information from it, and it's becoming the main source, and they're pushing for that, then Facebook or Twitter should be viewed as the government. They have become the government. They're run for profit by a multinational corporation, but they're playing the role of government. So that's not an acceptable form of government. If you're going to do that, if social network, Twitter or Facebook or other social media are that important in our lives for getting information, communicating with each other, they've essentially become government. They have to be participatory. What does that mean? It means Facebook, Twitter doesn't belong to Elon Musk. It belongs to all of us who participate in it, who make all the content for it, who use it every day. So we should vote on what the policy is for Facebook, or for that matter, for Zoom, and that should be binding. And so we should set up a constitution. I mean, I wasn't going to talk about social media because it's a slightly different issue than the issue of information is the more fundamental one, but social media is similar. So social media should be a republic, run like a republic, a democratic republic, in which we're all not users but citizens, and we should have direct or indirect. I mean, actually, I think we should have both indirect democracy and direct democracy, and we don't have that now. We don't have that now. The question, coming back to your question, you suggest, what can I do right now? And I guess at some level, I think it's a difficult question because the evolution has to be, transformative. So in a way, what we can do now is come up with our vision for what a constitution of information should be, how information should be governed globally, and how social networks or search engines should be governed globally as commons, as common space used by the citizens of the earth. And then once we develop these ideas, we should move towards that moment at which they will be implemented. But I doubt that it can be a slow transition. I think there has to be a moment at which you shift from one to the other. You shift for a for-profit search engine, social network, information, PR, public relations, entertainment media complex, where you shift from that to a constitution-based, ethics-based, science-based, morality-based, citizen-based, participatory, and rules-based commons.
Well, okay, so what you're saying right now sounds just like the cypherpunks, more or less. I mean, back, say, in the 1990s. And it did quite kind of look like that.
I remember.
Yeah, like Stevenson and, all of these guys.
I remember.
But then by the time the smartphone came on, say like the last 10 years, for example, it's gone all out
Right.
whack, right? Even somebody like Jack Dorsey, the Twitter, he said he contributed to this this massive centralization. What do you open source a constitution of information?
Well, as you know, I mean, we had interaction with Google. We talked to the Schmidt before. I mean, so I think Google, although the name is the same, it's changed. It's no longer the same entity that it was previously. And there was an initial moment in which, in 2004, I guess, where there's all this potential and all this creativity, all this, possibility, participatory activity, art, intellectual exchange. And that, I think, has died over the last 4 years. So in a way, we're going back to those original, heady days. But I think the difference is that now the whole point of using the word constitution is to say we're going to have rules, right? It's not going to be it's not going to be a totalitarian state, as unlike what Facebook or Google or Twitter or others may be pushing us towards. But it's also not going to be the Wild West. We're going to have agreed on participatory democratic process, but a democracy, and this is very important, especially when we're talking about constitution of information, truth and scientific investigation is not democratic by nature, right? I mean, having 95% of people vote and say, viruses don't exist, or, the world is flat. I mean, all these things are very popular now on internet.
Right.
I mean, this does not cut it. I don't care if 99.9% of the people say the world is flat. It's not going to make it true. So that's the whole point of the Constitution. To come back to the Constitution issue, the whole point of a Constitution is that you should not have just a democracy. everyone votes, and whoever gets the most votes wins. That you have to have a democratic republic, right? And the republic part is a critical issue, a system of rules that are followed over long periods of time that protect the right of the individual against the crowd, against the mass. And this, I think, also has to be a factor in information, which is basically about truth, which is to say Google or Facebook checkers, right? Or the NSA, or even the majority of people in the world are not going to determine what is true. That there are criteria, which, intellectuals have spent the last 3,000 years in epistemology and metaphysics, studying and discussing how you ascertain what the truth is. There are, so I would say, just as a footnote, there are some profound questions about the nature of reality, the nature of God, the metaphysical questions, for which there is not a perfect resolution, which we have tensions that exist. But those have no application to the question of ascertaining, whether there's climate change, or whether, such and such exists, or whether, what's happening in Ukraine is accurate. I mean, these things can be ascertained. I mean, they may be complex. They may not be simple, but they can be ascertained, and we can assert or come up with systems for asserting and confirming what's accurate. And we don't have that now.
When you talk about, there are two things that you talked about that I want to bring together. One is you talked about Huxley and Orwell, and then you talked about the republic. So a republic, a res publica, is a public state, as opposed to like a monarchy, which is a private state. A monarchy, or the aristocrats own the state. And then a democratic res publica is the foundation of a modern democracy is the integrity of the individual. So you can't have a majority. For example, this is why we don't say take babies or old people and do medical research on them, because they're the weakest in society, right? But we don't all get together as a majority and vote to do medical research on vulnerable people in society. Or where it does, then it's legal, put in jail. So when you combine these two, and then you bring in to have a governance system. This is why they always say democracy looks messy, but I would say democracy is dynamic, because you have this constant information flow, and then how we determine the verification system. So say, for example, let's explore the epistemology here right at the end, as we move to the end. With epistemology, as you said, we can determine something that happened when we talk about an empirically verified truth. I look through a telescope and I say, do you see that round thing there? And it looks like it has a ring around it. And you say, yeah, I see that too. Oh, and the physicist says that's Saturn. You can do this kind of verification, and you have the experts. You have experts looking at a system, and they give the information to the public, and public representatives make the decisions. For the information system, because of the digital nature of it, and then the smartphone, the constitution of information, I think, one is at least alert people to guidelines, and then I think some kind of practical. Remember a few years ago we were talking about a digital republic of letters, that project out of Stanford. Okay, that could be more like the intellectual dark web, and then you could have general education for anybody who wants to learn about how do you verify something from Al Jazeera, whatever. I mean, this kind of thing has to happen as a pretty much public wide system. The other thing I wanted to say, go ahead. Yep.
I was going to say, we discussed this earlier years ago with the issue of response to Fukushima, and how you could have this participatory discussion. And this has really been a real loss, is this effort to dominate education, discourse, public intellectuals with this tiny handful of like elite universities that sort of like try and grab the whole pie using their connections to Google, Facebook, Twitter, whatever.
Yeah, and then going back to Huxley and Orwell, think about currently, you have well, at least one major billionaire, right? Elon Musk, but there's other ones that have added on to this Twitter thing.
Right.
When we talk about a res publica, where free speech is protected, and you talk
Right.
about a private sector, basically you have two entities in a private sector, Twitter and then this group of billionaires that are buying it. These are all private sector companies saying that they're going to bring free speech. But the protection of free speech is in the res publica, not in private sector. They can contribute, but the foundational constitution is over here. Can you just comment on, is this not an Orwellian moment?
Well, I mean, Orwell, to say it's Orwellian, of course, is a problem because it just leads people to a bunch of, associations they have in their mind. I think in some way it is an Orwellian moment, but in some ways it's better to look at it as a parallel to that, say, 17th and 18th century, the question of absolutism versus democratic republics, and this idea from the American Revolution, and then of course the French Revolution, and then the revolutions of the 1840s in Germany and Central Europe, that there's this idea that you, rather than being just indebted to the goodwill and the enlightenment of billionaires who will grant you certain freedoms, but are free to take them away at any time, to say that this constitutional space of discourse, of learning, of interaction with our peers around the world, and of governance, ultimately, because all governance is based upon accurate information. You can't govern without information. That this is not something, it's not a matter of investment, it's not a matter of making money, and billionaires have no particular say in this. I'm not saying billionaires can't talk about the subject, but just to say, if we're going to sit down at the table and discuss what the future of social networks are, it's not obvious to any of us why any billionaire should be there at all. There are lots of people who have been very active in social movements, in academics, in scholarship, and the issue of science, technology, and society, who have the qualifications, the wisdom, and the vision to be very helpful. I don't think really any billionaire has any real say in that process, any more than I think that a rich merchant from Boston had any say in the United States Constitutional Convention. It was there were rich people there, and of course Hamilton represented a certain sort of faction within the group. But what made the Constitution work, and it did work for all its flaws, it really did work, was that the group was not there to represent their financial interests.
Right, got it. Right, so a constitution is that, it's these overarching principles. It's not a specific commercial, religious, or whatever other endeavor.
Well, the United States could have been. This happened in other places in the world that were run by the British East India Company, for example, which took a very different approach than the United States Constitution in terms of how governance would be carried out. So this is what the United States, United States is we're both products of the United States. It's both, a dream and a nightmare. And it's not our purpose to defend the terrible record the United States has had in many respects. But the fact that it has done terrible things doesn't mean there's tremendous value in some of its institutions.
That's a good place to start, end off with there. Emanuel, thank you so much for this engaging discussion. Maybe we ought to come back and do this again.
Looking forward to it.